photos, 7 levels. I've put together an iceberg of photos with seriously disturbing backstories. They're gonna start pretty uncomfortable and dark, but the deeper we get into the iceberg, the more disturbing and shocking they'll become. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. Musician trips and falls 600 feet. On August 20th, 2022, Andrea Mazzetto and his girlfriend Sara Brigante climbed Altar Noto, a distinctive rock formation resembling an altar in Rozzo, Italy, his hometown. Andrea had been documenting their climb, sharing uploads with his 2,500 Instagram followers. Little did they know, it was all about to go horribly wrong. Standing near the precipice, they smiled for a selfie against the breathtaking backdrop of the Italian mountains. Moments after taking that photograph, Mazzetto's phone slipped from his grasp, heading for the edge of that 300-foot ravine. Without hesitation, Mazzetto moved to grab it, but as he reached for his phone, the ground beneath him gave way, causing him to lose his balance at the cliff's edge and tumble 650 feet into the Valdastico Valley below, all while Sara watched in horror. A massive rescue operation was launched immediately. Firefighters, alpine rescue officers, and medical personnel rushed to the remote location, but they were too late. When rescuers finally reached Mazzetto's body, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Following the tragedy, Sara shared their final photograph on Instagram, calling it our cursed last photo together. The image that had captured their joy now documented their final moments together. Melissa Lourdes Lopez. It was September 18th, 2019, and in Williamton, Melissa Lourdes Lopez, 16 years old, had come to honor someone who never made it past March 2018. Alex Gutierrez's brother, killed at this exact spot by gun violence 18 months earlier. Alex himself stood among the crowd that afternoon, having carried the weight of organizing this remembrance in honor of his loved one. The group clustered together on the 800 block of Bayview Avenue. Melissa posed for a photograph to commemorate the occasion. It would be her last. Seconds after taking that photo at 3:11 p.m., someone approached the memorial gathering, walking up to the group with purpose and a weapon. With absolutely no warning, the gun discharged, firing through the crowd and taking down 4 innocent people before they even had a chance to realize what was going on. Melissa was one of them. It took 10 minutes before Melissa finally succumbed to her injuries, pronounced dead at the scene when the coroner arrived. Alex also took a bullet, lasting longer than Melissa, making it to the hospital before dying at 4:49 p.m., the second in his family to die because of gun violence. 2 women, one in her 70s, also caught bullets but managed to survive. The shooter vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving behind a horrific, brutal crime scene. The photograph remained frozen in time, capturing the final seconds of a life that ended exactly where another had ended before. The shooter was never found or identified. Christopher McCandless. On September 6, 1992, moose hunters in Alaska found an abandoned bus with a note taped to the door. SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. Inside, they found a blue sleeping bag containing the dead body of a young man and a camera. The image would haunt them forever. Christopher McCandless walked into the Alaskan wilderness in April 1992 with nothing more than a .22 caliber rifle, some books, and 10 pounds of rice. He had hitchhiked from South Dakota to Fairbanks, carrying what witnesses described as laughably inadequate supplies for one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The last person to see him alive was an electrician named Jim Gallion, who tried desperately to talk McCandless out of his plan, even offering to buy him proper gear, but McCandless refused everything. He found an abandoned city bus, a rusted hulk that had been serving as an emergency shelter for hunters and trappers. Bus 142 became his home for what would be the final 113 days of his life. For the first 2 months, McCandless managed to hunt small game and forage for berries. His journal entries from this period were almost cheerful, documenting his daily catches of squirrels, porcupines, and birds. But by day 67, McCandless had decided to return to civilization. He packed his belongings, shaved his beard, and hiked back toward the highway. But when he reached the same waterway he had easily crossed in April, he found a raging torrent swollen by glacier melt, an impassable wall of churning current. He turned back to the bus, defeated. The journal entries that followed were not joyful. McCandless began eating wild potato seeds, not knowing they contained a neurotoxin that would slowly paralyze his digestive system. As the poison accumulated in his body, he grew weaker, unable to hunt effectively or gather enough food. His handwriting became increasingly erratic. By day 107, his final entry, he could barely hold a pen. Somewhere around this time, McCandless taped that desperate note to the bus door and set up his camera's self-timer, taking the photograph that the hunters would find. It was a selfie of him holding a farewell message. "I've had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all." Level 2. Marco Siffredi's daring descent. Marco Siffredi was already making history when most people his age were figuring out their careers. The French professional mountaineer had conquered peaks across the Alps and Himalayas, but Everest called to him with a particular intensity. In 2001, he became the first person to complete a full snowboard descent from Everest's summit to advanced base camp, carving his way down the Norton Couloir in just over 2 hours. But that still wasn't enough. The Onben Couloir was calling. Steeper than his first route, with slopes between 45 and 55 degrees, it represented what many called the greatest line never skied. Siffredi returned to Everest in September 2002, determined to conquer what he considered the holy grail of extreme snowboarding. But the conditions were different this time. Where his first ascent had been swift and confident, this second climb took over 12 hours through waist-deep snow. His Sherpa companions noticed the change immediately. Prabhatashi, who had summited Everest 21 times, watched Siffredi struggle in ways that seemed unusual for someone of his caliber. They reached the summit at 12:15 p.m. on September 8th. The final photograph shows Siffredi at the peak, exhausted, telling Furba, "At the summit, but tired. Tired. Too much snow, too much climbing." After just 1 hour of rest, despite his Sherpa's warnings about deteriorating weather conditions, Siffredi strapped on his yellow snowboard suit and pushed off toward the Onben Couloir. The Sherpas watched him disappear into the clouds, his tracks continuing down to 8,600 meters before they simply stopped. Nobody could find a body or any equipment, just tracks that ended as if he had vanished into the mountain itself. 23 years later, Marco Siffredi remains somewhere on Everest, the mountain keeping its most disturbing secret. Philip Hughes. 25-year-old Philip Hughes walked into pitch number 7 at the Sydney Cricket Ground on November 25, 2014 with everything to play for. He needed runs to secure his spot back in Australia's test team, and he was doing very, very well. Sean Abbott, the New South Wales fast bowler, had been targeting Hughes with short-pitched deliveries throughout the day. 20 of the 23 bouncers bowled that day were aimed directly at Hughes. He handled them expertly, as expected from someone with his skill level. Then came the 21st bouncer. Abbott released the ball and Hughes moved into position for what should have been just another hook shot. But Hughes was early through his shot, misjudging the pace. The ball, traveling at 140 kilometers per hour, struck him on the unprotected area at the base of his skull just below his helmet. The impact compressed his vertebral artery, one of the main blood vessels feeding his brain. Within moments, the artery split, sending blood cascading into his brain cavity. Hughes stood for a second or two, then began to sway before collapsing face forward onto the pitch. Medical staff performed CPR on the field while Hughes remained unconscious. A helicopter landed at the ground as paramedics worked to stabilize him before rushing him to St. Vincent's Hospital, where surgeons immediately recognized the catastrophic nature of his injury. They had no choice but to remove sections of his skull to relieve pressure on his swelling brain. The operation lasted 80 minutes, but Hughes never regained consciousness. For 48 hours, doctors monitored his condition as his family maintained their vigil. On On November 27, 2014, just 3 days before his 26th birthday, Philip Hughes died from what medical experts called one of the rarest injuries ever recorded in sport. Only 100 cases of vertebral artery dissection had ever been documented in medical literature, with just one previous case caused by a cricket ball. He got extremely unlucky. John Allen Chow. John Allen Chow paid fishermen 25,000 rupees to ferry him to North Sentinel Island in November 2018, knowing full well the Sentinelese had killed outsiders before. He was a 26-year-old American missionary who had spent years preparing for this moment, studying at Oral Roberts University and training with All Nations, an organization that sends missionaries to remote locations. He carried a waterproof Bible and gifts of fish, convinced he could convert one of the world's most isolated tribes to Christianity. The fishermen, who knew it was a terrible idea, dropped him off about 500 meters from shore on November 15th, watching as he paddled his kayak toward the beach. The Sentinelese immediately drew their bows, forcing Chow to retreat after his first attempt. He wrote in his diary that evening about feeling disappointed they didn't accept him right away, but he planned to try again the next day. But the next day was no better. In a move that was a clear omen, a young tribesman shot an arrow that pierced the Bible Chow held against his chest. The metal-tipped arrow struck page 453 of Isaiah, and Chow broke off the shaft before swimming nearly a mile back to the fishing boat. His final journal entry, on November 16th, revealed his growing fear but unwavering determination to return. He wrote to his family telling them they might think he was crazy, but that declaring Jesus to these people was worth the risk. The fishermen later testified that Chow instructed them to abandon him on November 17th no matter what happened. They watched from a distance as the Sentinelese dragged his arrow-struck body across the beach, burying him in the sand. Indian authorities attempted to recover the body but were met with armed Sentinelese wielding bows and arrows, forcing them to withdraw. Chow's remains were never retrieved from the island, and the tribe never embraced Christianity. While we're on the subject, if you want more great videos like this one, be sure to embrace this channel and subscribe. But right now, let's move on to the next level. Level 3. Brianne Altus. In 2013, Brianne Altus was one of Davis High School's most trusted English teachers. But she was crossing serious lines. She had been with the district since 2004, working her way up to her position. What started as daily flirtations from teenage students became something far more dangerous. The first boy was 17 when he approached police in October 2013, telling investigators he'd had intimate encounters with Alice at least 7 times over nearly 2 years. He could describe her tattoos, the layout of her home, details that made his account impossible to dismiss. When confronted, Altus admitted to investigators she had been intimate with him at least twice. But that was just the beginning. 2 more students came forward, both describing similar experiences. One was 16, the other 17 when their relationships with Altus began. The encounters happened in cars, at parks, at her home while her husband was away. She was arrested soon after. But even after her arrest, even while facing multiple felony charges, Altus continued her relationship with one of the boys. She was out on bail, supposedly learning from her mistakes, but instead she was deepening the very behavior that had gotten her arrested. Text messages with explicit photos, continued intimate encounters, all while the legal system was deciding her fate. The school district had apparently seen warning signs, even reprimanding her after seeing inappropriate photos with students, but failed to take decisive action. By January 2015, prosecutors had enough evidence to ask that her bail be revoked entirely. She'd committed 4 more felonies while awaiting trial. When the judge finally sentenced her in July 2015, he questioned whether she truly understood what she'd done. Despite her tearful apology, he saw someone who continued making excuses, who blamed everyone but herself. She was sentenced up to 30 years in prison for 3 counts of forcible criminal conduct. Dr. George Tiller. Dr. George Tiller had spent decades knowing someone wanted him dead. He became one of America's most controversial doctors by performing third trimester abortions, a procedure that made him both a hero to desperate families and a target for extremists. His clinic, Women's Healthcare Services, was one of only 3 in the entire country offering these late-term procedures. The threats started early and never stopped. In 1986, a pipe bomb blast heavily damaged his clinic, but Tiller hung a defiant sign in the rubble reading, "Hell no, we won't go." In 1993, anti-abortion extremist Shelley Shannon shot him in both arms while he sat in his car outside the clinic. He returned to work the next day. By this point, Tiller's life was a fortress. He wore body armor daily, even to church, and hired armed guards to patrol his clinic behind bulletproof glass. Federal marshals protected him for 30 months. He hired a Brinks armored truck just to drive him to work. The FBI had warned him he was being targeted by anti-abortion militants. The harassment campaign intensified when Fox News host Bill O'Reilly began calling him Tiller the Baby Killer on 29 separate episodes between 2005 and 2009.
Tiller the Baby Killer.
O'Reilly compared him to Nazis and said he operated a death mill. As the rhetoric grew more violent, anonymous tips warned the FBI that a man named Scott Roeder would do physical harm to Tiller. On May 31st, 2009, Roeder waited patiently in the pews at Reformation Lutheran Church. Tiller was serving as an usher, handing out programs to fellow churchgoers. Roeder walked into the foyer, pressed a gun against Tiller's forehead, and pulled the trigger. One shot, point-blank range. Tiller died instantly. Roeder threatened 2 church members who tried to stop him, then fled in a blue Ford Taurus. Police caught him 3 hours later, but to many anti-abortion campaigners, he was a hero. Chris Cornell. It was May 17, 2017, and at the Fox Theater in Detroit, Soundgarden was delivering what would become their final performance. Chris Cornell commanded the stage for nearly 2 hours, but something felt off to those watching closely. He staggered across the stage, his movements unusually weak, and by the second song, it seemed like the energy had drained from his body. He missed entire blocks of lyrics, letting the crowd fill in the gaps while he walked off stage mid-performance, leaving his bandmates to play instrumentals. Cornell spoke fondly of Detroit throughout the night, repeatedly praising the audience and declaring his love for the city's crowds. Yet, one comment lingered. "I feel bad for the next city," he told the audience after saying nothing could top Detroit. By 11:30 p.m., Cornell was back in room 1136 at the MGM Grand Detroit. His bodyguard, Martin Kirsten, helped fix his computer and administered 2 prescribed Ativan pills for anxiety. 5 minutes later, Cornell's wife Vicky called from Los Angeles, noticing their home lights flickering on and off, something Cornell could control remotely from his phone. When she asked about it, he denied doing it recently, claiming he had done so an hour earlier while still on stage. Cornell's speech was slurred and he kept repeating, "I'm just tired." He complained about technical problems during the show and admitted taking an extra Ativan or 2. Vicky grew increasingly alarmed as his tone shifted, becoming cocky and aggressive, behavior that reminded her of his past struggles with prescription 14 years earlier. At 12:15 a.m., Vicky contacted Kirsten, demanding that he check on her husband. The bodyguard found Cornell's door latched from the inside. Hotel security refused to help, saying Kirsten wasn't authorized to enter, so he kicked the door open. The bedroom door was also latched. In the bathroom, Cornell lay on the floor with blood running from his mouth and a red exercise band around his neck. The band was secured to a carabiner jammed so tightly into the doorframe that it left permanent indentations. By 11:30 a.m., doctors had pronounced him dead. Toxicology reports later revealed he had 4 times the prescribed level of Ativan in his system. Death Note. The grainy footage captures everything in real time. Chalino Sanchez is performing at Salon Bugambilias in Culiacan, Sinaloa on May 15, 1992. Someone from the crowd hands him a folded piece of paper during Alma Enamorada, and the camera keeps rolling as he reads it. His face drains of color instantly, sweat beading on his forehead as he processes whatever words are written there. The note's contents remain unknown to this day, lost when Cellino crumpled it up and let it fall to the stage floor. But the visible shock on his face tells the whole story. His wife, Maricela, later questioned whether it was actually a death threat, suggesting Cellino wouldn't have been foolish enough to continue if he truly believed his life was in immediate danger. Yet the timing makes that impossible to ignore. What happened after the show is what makes this footage so chilling to watch. After midnight, Cellino left the venue with his brothers, a cousin, and several women. Black Chevrolet Suburbans pulled them over with men flashing state police identification cards. They wanted to speak with Cellino specifically, claiming their commander needed to see him. Cellino got into their vehicle while the others stayed behind. By 6 a.m, 2 farmers found his body beside an irrigation canal near Highway 15, blindfolded with rope marks on his wrists, with 2 bullets to the back of his head. The investigation never produced arrests or established a clear motive. The footage of that final performance remains the last documented moments of Cellino Sanchez alive and performing. Dalen Pua. 18-year-old Dalen Moke Pua left his grandmother's house in Waianae at 6 a.m. on February 27, 2015, telling her that he was going hiking. His grandmother had already warned him against climbing the haiku stairs, known as the Stairway to Heaven, after he'd mentioned his interest in it. The 3,922 metal steps had been closed to the public since 1987, but that hadn't stopped hikers from attempting the climb. Pua boarded a bus heading towards Oahu's windward side, carrying a red backpack and wearing black surf shorts with a white long-sleeved shirt. He posted on Facebook the day before asking followers to wish him luck on what he called an insane hike. Around 11 a.m., he began texting photos to his family and friends, documenting his progress. Those images would become the last evidence of his existence. When family members later examined the photos, they spotted something that made their blood run cold. In one picture showing the surrounding vegetation, you can see a figure crouched in the bushes, partially hidden behind branches and leaves. The man's head was clearly visible above the foliage while his body remained concealed, as if he were deliberately staying out of sight. The mysterious figure sparked immediate theories about what happened to Pua. Police took the photos seriously enough to issue a public appeal asking the unknown person to come forward, but no one ever did. Search teams scoured the dangerous ridgeline for days, with some hikers reporting they heard desperate cries for help echoing from below the trail. The screams were so disturbing that witnesses called 911, but rescuers couldn't locate the source. Pua's body has never been found. Strangled over a board game. On Christmas Day, 2010, in Alberta, Minnesota, Tamara Lee Mason had spent the day with her 3 sons, Dylan, Andrew, and Jacob. The family had finished their Christmas dinner, and as the evening settled in, Tamara made what seemed like an innocent suggestion. She wanted to play Yahtzee with her boys. But Jacob didn't want to play. In an inexplicable act, he strangled her on the living room floor while his brothers watched. But Jacob wasn't finished. Either he or his brother Andrew placed a plastic bag over their mother's head and tightened a belt around her neck, a cruel way to end her life. The autopsy would later confirm that Tamara died from asphyxiation from neck compression leading to a fractured larynx. The brothers checked for a pulse after Jacob stopped choking her. There was none. It was a senseless act. With their mother's body cooling on the floor, the 3 sons had to decide what to do next. They couldn't bury her immediately. The Minnesota ground was frozen solid in December, so Dylan came up with a plan. He loaded Tamara's body into a garbage can and drove it all the way to South Dakota, intending to burn her remains in a furnace. But something changed his mind during that long drive. He turned around and brought her body back to Minnesota, storing it in a shed behind their house. For months, Tamara Lee Mason's remains sat in that shed while her sons waited for the ground to thaw enough for her burial. They reported her missing on December 27th. telling authorities she had left the house after becoming upset that no one would play Yahtzee with her. The lie was so mundane, so believable, that investigators had no leads for months. But everything began to unravel in May 2011 when friends started talking. One friend told deputies that Dylan had discussed disposing of a body and had mentioned his younger brother strangling their mother. By July 6th, Dylan finally confessed to investigators. On July 7th, 2011, authorities discovered Tamara's remains buried in the backyard where her sons had finally laid her to rest. 7 months after Christmas Day, Tamara Lee Mason was finally found, but this photo remains a tragic remnant of that night. The killers were later convicted and sentenced for what they did to their mother, but by that point, the family was irreversibly destroyed. Andrei Emil Yanikyov. It was November 1st, 2017, and at Moscow's West Complex Continuing Education College, 18-year-old Andrei Emil Yanikyov walked through the corridors carrying a bag that concealed a hunting knife, a circular saw, and other weapons. His target was Sergei Danilov, his health and safety instructor who had recently threatened him with expulsion. During a break between classes, Emil Yanikov approached Danilov from behind in his classroom and slashed his teacher's throat with a blade. But he didn't flee after the attack. He didn't even try to leave the scene. Instead, Emil Yanikov pulled out his phone and began documenting his work. He snapped multiple selfies positioning himself over Danilov's corpse, with a toothpick casually dangling from his mouth. The images showed him smiling, relaxed, as if he just completed a class task. Emil Yanikov posted the photos in real time to VKontakte, Russia's largest social media platform. The posts included images of the bloodied knife and his casual poses beside the body. For weeks beforehand, Emil Yanikov had been posting the hashtag 11117, the date of his planned attack. Forum members later recalled him complaining about Danilov months earlier and even threatening to kill the teacher, but they dismissed it as typical online posturing. Nobody thought he had it in him. But when another instructor entered the classroom and discovered the scene, Emil Yanikov's documentation session ended. He turned the circular saw on himself, ending both his crime spree and his life. Disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi. On May 20th, 1983, 15-year-old Emanuela Orlandi sat in the front row of a RAI television studio wearing jeans and a light blue vest, appearing alongside her classmates on the program Tandem. The footage shows a typical teenager, slightly awkward under the studio lights, completely unaware that in exactly 32 days, she would become Italy's most famous missing person. Emanuela lived inside Vatican City with her family, one of the few non-clerical citizens granted residency because her father worked for the papal household. On June 22, 1983, she left home for her regular flute session at the Lodovico da Victoria Music School near Piazza Navona. The day was sweltering, with Rome baking under an unusually brutal heat wave. After her lesson, she called home from a payphone around 7 p.m. She told her sister Frederica about a man who had approached her claiming to represent Avon Cosmetics. He offered her work distributing flyers for an astronomical sum, 375,000 lira for a single day's work, roughly equivalent to $200 today. Her sister immediately found the amount excessive and suspicious, but she couldn't convince Emanuela not to meet with him. Emanuela was supposed to meet friends at a bus stop on Corso Rinascimento. Witnesses reported seeing a girl matching her description getting into a dark green BMW. From that moment, she vanished completely. When Avon's management learned of the incident, they confirmed they employed no male representatives and never used such recruitment methods. The Vatican doors closed at midnight that evening, and Emanuela never returned home. What happened to her remains a total mystery even today. She's never been found, and her captor has never been identified. The Vatican occasionally releases more information from their archives, but so far, it hasn't helped. Level 4. Sophie Lyonnais. This is the final image of Sophie Lyonnais, a 21-year-old French nanny. It was taken 2 days before firefighters would discover her charred remains in a Wimbledon garden. Her eyes are downcast, her face is gaunt. The once vibrant woman who had arrived in London to improve her English was barely recognizable to those who knew her. Before she moved to work for Sabrina Coudier and Wissem Medouni, she was a much brighter young woman. But what the camera captured on September 18, 2017 was the result of 12 days of systematic brutality. The couple she was working for had become convinced that Sophie was spying on Coudier's ex-boyfriend Mark Walton, a founding member of the Irish pop band Boyzone. Coudier and Medouni had subjected Sophie to over 8 hours of recorded interrogations, slapping her, calling her worse than a killer, and forcing her to confess to crimes that existed only in their shared delusion. The recordings reveal Sophie quietly sobbing in the background after the sound of strikes. She had 5 fractured ribs and a cracked breastbone by this point. In that final video confession, Sophie appears broken and barely alive. Hours later, she would be forced into a bathtub where she drowned during what the couple claimed was another interrogation session. The pathologist found blood in her nostrils indicating blunt force trauma to her face. Her jaw had been fractured just hours before her death. When firefighters arrived on September 20th, they found Medouni standing beside a barbecue cooking chicken while Sophie's body burned in a bonfire nearby. He told them he was burning a sheep. Both Medouni and Coudier were arrested at the scene on suspicion of murder. Their attempts at deception quickly collapsed under investigation, while Sophie's loved ones grieved their tragic loss. Takashi Yokoyama's fatal crash. The 1997 Japanese Formula 3 Championship finale at Fuji Speedway was already decided before the green flag dropped. Dutch driver Tom Coronel had locked up the title with 6 wins in 8 races, but the season's final act would be remembered for something far more devastating than a championship win. On October 19th, 22 cars were lined up on the grid. Yokoyama sat in 17th position, deep in the pack but hungry to move forward. He had his Dallara ready to charge through the field on Fuji's long main straight. But in the opening moments, Coronel jumped into the lead. Behind him, Shigekazu Wakisaka clipped his rear wheel under braking. Suddenly, Wakisaka's car launched into the air, executing a double roll before landing partly on Coronel's machine and partly on the Dutchman's helmet. Both drivers walked away with nothing more than tire marks on Coronel's helmet. It was insanely lucky for everybody involved. The safety car came out to prevent further incidents, sending out radio calls to all drivers to slow down and prepare for the pace car to lead the field. Most drivers responded immediately, forming a queue behind the slowing pack on the front stretch. Yokoyama didn't get the message. Racing at 160 miles per hour through the main straight, he approached the suddenly stationary group of cars ahead. There was no time to brake, no space to swerve. As Dallara slammed into the back of another vehicle, the impact launching his car 5 meters into the air. The Dallara became a projectile, flinging up toward the overhead gantry that carried the electric signboard 16.5 feet above the track. The car disintegrated on impact, scattering debris across 500 meters of asphalt. Yokoyama was thrown from the wreckage and died immediately from catastrophic injuries. The race was instantly canceled, unable to go on given the tragedy. Mountain murder. Jolie Callan texted her friend the night before the hike with what seemed like a joke. "If something happens to me, you'll know who I was with." She was talking about Lauren Bunner, her ex-boyfriend who had convinced her to go hiking together as friends on Mount Chiaja. Months earlier, she had finally managed to break free after he repeatedly threatened to end his own life whenever she tried to leave. Now she had a new boyfriend and college plans ahead. But Bunner wasn't done with her. On August 20th, 2015, he picked her up for what he'd pitched as a symbolic friendship hike. He even brought along her dog, making the whole thing seem innocent. Before they headed out, Bunner posted the first photo to Instagram. Jolie sitting in his car with the dog on her lap, captioned, "On our way to go hiking." The Pinhoti Trail was long and remote enough that you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. The whole time, Bunner kept posting. She walked the dog, held it while looking out at the view, then stood on the edge of a cliff, taking her own photo of the landscape. That final image showed her back to the camera, facing the misty mountains with her camera raised. Bunner captioned it, "Oh, you know, just enjoying the view." Minutes after posting that photo, he shot her twice with a Bear Claw 22 and threw her body off the 40-foot cliff, backpack still on. While driving home, Bunner called 911 and calmly told dispatchers,
911, what's your emergency?
"I want to turn myself in for the killing of my ex-girlfriend that happened just a little while ago on Jiaha Mountain." He pulled over and waited for the police to arrest him. Despite his attempts to weasel his way out of questioning, Bunner ultimately pleaded guilty and received a 52-year prison sentence. Gilles Leclerc and Marianne Lebanon. This selfie shows two faces pressed together, smiling in the dim light of Paris's Bataclan Concert Hall. Gilles Leclerc and Marianne Lebanon had arrived early on November 13, 2015, eager to see Eagles of Death Metal perform. The photo captures that ordinary moment before a show when couples document their night out, unaware that three men had been waiting outside in a black rental car for over an hour. At 9:47 p.m., just as the band played Kiss the Devil, the attackers burst through the entrance and opened fire, which the audience initially mistook for pyrotechnics. Gilles and Marianne were positioned toward the back of the venue where the gunmen began their attack. The attackers walked among those lying on the floor, kicking bodies and shooting anyone who showed signs of life. The hall was totally dark except for muzzle flashes as the gunmen continued firing. People scrambled over each other toward emergency exits only to find the third attacker positioned there, cutting down those who tried to escape. Gilles was struck during the initial wave of gunfire, but he managed to help Marianne survive by shielding her body with his own. She remained motionless among the corpses, following the instinct that saved many others that night, playing dead while the attackers reloaded 3 or 4 times. The shooting continued for nearly 20 minutes before police finally arrived. Gilles' family spent days searching Paris hospitals, sending photos of his distinctive tattoos to investigators. His mother pleaded on the radio for information until his death was confirmed on November 16. Marianne had escaped, but she would forever live with the trauma of losing the love of her life. Mount St. Helens eruption. This photograph shows David Alexander Johnston, a volcanologist sitting in a folding chair, writing in a notebook, smiling toward the camera. Pretty normal stuff. Harry Glicken snapped this image at 7 p.m. on May 17, 1980, at the Coldwater 2 observation post just 5.5 miles from Mount St. Helens. Neither man knew this would be their last picture. Actually, Johnston wasn't supposed to be there that morning. He had traded shifts with a colleague who needed to meet with foreign graduate students. The mountain had been building pressure for months, with a major bulge swelling on its north face by 5 feet per day. Scientists knew something was coming, but back then, it was assumed that the mountain would erupt upward if it erupted at all. The morning of May 18th, Johnston made his routine measurements and observations. But at 8:32 a.m., a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck the north face. Suddenly, the entire weakened slope gave way in the largest landslide in recorded history. Without the cap of Earth to contain the pressure, Mount St. Helens exploded sideways. Johnston managed to radio Vancouver, but the lateral blast traveled at speeds up to 670 miles per hour, reaching supersonic velocities through much of the devastated area. The pyroclastic flows carried temperatures of 1,000 degrees Celsius. The blast would have taken less than a minute to reach Johnston's position. He never stood a chance. His body was never found. State highway workers discovered remnants of his USGS trailer in 1993, 13 years after the incident. This photo is all that remains, capturing a man working peacefully hours before a mountain erased him from existence. Level 5. The last breath of a Thai Navy SEAL. The water was rising faster than anyone had calculated. Former Navy SEAL Saman Gunan knew this when he volunteered to dive back in to the Tam Luang Cave system on July 5th, 2018, carrying oxygen tanks that would keep 13 trapped boys alive. They had been underground for 2 weeks, and the oxygen levels in their chamber had dropped to a dangerous 15%. Gunan's mission was straightforward but deadly. He had to transport air tanks through flooded passages to establish a supply line. Each dive took over 5 hours round trip through passages so narrow that divers had to squeeze through single file. To make it worse, the cave was consuming oxygen faster than they could pump it in, with hundreds of rescue workers breathing the same stale air. Every tank Gunan delivered bought the trapped team more time, but the math was getting worse by the hour. At 1 a.m. on July 6, Gunan was swimming back from Chamber 3 after successfully placing his oxygen tanks when his own air supply ran out. In a horrific moment of realization, his diving partner watched him lose consciousness in the black water. They dragged him to Chamber 3 and attempted resuscitation, but Gunan never regained consciousness. The irony was horrible. A mission designed to prevent oxygen depletion had claimed a life due to oxygen loss. Gunan's death proved that even elite divers couldn't guarantee their own survival in these conditions. His body was carried out while the boys he died trying to save remained trapped another 4 days. They were eventually rescued, in part because of his efforts. Selfie footage unknowingly captures last moments of Titan submarine. Abby Jackson was 22 years old when she was hired by OceanGate to document their submarine expedition. She had watched them prepare the Titan submersible for its descent to the Titanic wreckage, capturing every moment of it on her camera. She had no idea she was recording the last moments these 5 men would spend on the surface of the Earth. At 9:17 that morning, the Titan began its descent. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The crew exchanged routine messages with the Polar Prince above as planned, but then communication started breaking down. At 10:15, they reported losing system settings, with the support ship asking if they could see the Polar Prince on their display. The responses became sporadic. At 10:24, the Titan crew sent a message saying they were east-southeast of the bow, approaching the Titanic wreck. 13 minutes later, they reported being near the bow area, but their position was fluctuating wildly with each ping. Something was wrong. The final message came at 10:47. Dropped to WTS, they texted, meaning that they had released 2 weights to try ascending back to the surface. Then, silence. On her camera, Abby had captured the moment 5 people entered what would become their tomb. Deep below the surface of the water, the implosion happened in milliseconds. Their brains wouldn't have had time to process what was occurring. They were crushed by pressure 400 times greater than at sea level. Abby's video went viral after the disaster, viewed nearly 20 million times by people who understood what she couldn't have known in that moment. She was capturing the beginning of the end. Fatal crash of Lamia Flight 2933. The Brazilian Chapecoense football team boarded Lamia Flight 2933 on November 28, 2016, carrying dreams of their first major continental final. What they didn't know was that their chartered Avro RJ-85 was already operating on borrowed time before it even left the airport. The crew had discussed fuel calculations repeatedly during the flight, considering fueling stops at Leticia or Bogota, but decided to push through to their destination without stopping at all. The warning signs started early when the master caution alarm sounded at 2:36 a.m., notifying the flight crew they had only 20 minutes of fuel remaining. For 13 critical minutes, the pilots said nothing to air traffic control about their fuel emergency. At 2:49 a.m., they finally requested priority landing due to problems with the fuel. But when controllers asked if they could hold a little longer because another aircraft was below them, the crew had no choice but to declare a fuel emergency. The engines began failing in sequence. Engine number 3 shut down first, followed by engine 4. 2 minutes later, engines 2 and 1 went silent. The electrical systems died with the engines, plunging the aircraft into darkness. Unable to get a runway in time, the plane struck a hillside at 2,600 meters elevation. Of the 77 people aboard, 71 died instantly. 6 survivors emerged from the wreckage, including 3 Chapecoense players. Jackson Fullman, the goalkeeper, had his right leg amputated. Those who survived on the team had made it out with their lives, but their careers were permanently ended. Frank Delano Floyd. This is a photograph of Frank Delano Floyd and his daughter, only it's not actually his daughter. Her name was Suzanne Marie Savakis, and Floyd had taken her when she was just 5 years old. In 1975, while Suzanne's mother, Sandy Chipman, or Brandenburg, depending on who you ask, served a 30-day jail sentence for writing bad checks, Floyd disappeared with all 4 of her children. He later returned 2 of the girls to foster care but kept Suzanne and her infant brother as his own children. Floyd renamed her Sharon Marshall and moved constantly, registering her at schools under false identities to avoid being caught. Suzanne was top of her class, accepted to Georgia Tech on a full scholarship to study aerospace engineering, a brilliant young mind with a great future ahead of her. But Floyd had other plans. When she became pregnant during her senior year, he forced her to abandon her college dreams. He made her give up the first child for adoption, then moved her to Tampa, where he controlled every aspect of her existence. The man who had raised her as his daughter then forced her to marry him. She became Tanya Hughes while he took the name Clarence Hughes. She had another child named Michael, but Floyd wasn't the father. In 1990, at just 20 years old, Suzanne was found dying beside an Oklahoma highway after what appeared to be a hit and run. Floyd arrived at the hospital, playing the grieving spouse, while investigators noted inconsistencies in his story. She died just 5 days after arriving. Her 2-year-old son, Michael, entered foster care after DNA proved Floyd wasn't the biological father, but that wasn't the end for Floyd. In 1994, Floyd forced his way back into Michael's life. He walked into Michael's elementary school with a gun, took the principal hostage, and his 6-year-old so-called son. Hours later, the principal was found handcuffed to a tree, but Floyd and Michael vanished entirely. 20 years later, Floyd finally confessed, admitting he had killed Michael the same day, shooting him twice in the head when the child became difficult during their drive. The boy's body was never found. Level 6. The last Tsarevich of Russia. This is the last known photograph of Alexei Nikolaevich. He's on board the steamship Rus with his sister Olga in May 1918, their faces totally unaware of what awaits ahead of them. This 13-year-old boy had been born into absolute power as a Tsarevich, the future emperor of the largest country on Earth, but he would never reach his throne. This steamship was taking them to Yekaterinburg, where the Bolsheviks had already prepared what they called the House of Special Purpose. Their parents and Sister Maria had already been moved there weeks earlier. When Alexei arrived at the house, the Bolsheviks had transformed it into a fortress with 4-meter-high fences blocking any view from the street and windows painted to prevent anyone from seeing inside. Machine gun emplacements were pointed at the building from multiple directions, 300 guards rotating through shifts, their orders clear. Nobody escapes. The family lived under constant watch for 54 days. On July 17th, the Bolsheviks woke them at 2 a.m. claiming they needed to move to safety. In the basement room, 2 chairs were brought for Alexei and his mother. When the Bolsheviks announced their execution, the firing squad opened fire. Alexei remained in his chair, terrified as bullets struck his family. When the guns turned on him, Alexei survived the initial gunfire because jewels sewn into his clothing acted as armor. Finally, one of the Bolsheviks fired 2 shots into the boy's head. The bodies were transported to the Koptyaki forest, where they were with acid and grenades to prevent identification. The Bolsheviks announced only Nicholas's death initially, spreading disinformation about the family's fate for years. The remains weren't discovered until 1979, Alexei's bones eventually found in 2007. The photographs of the Rus became the final visual record of the last Russian heir who would never ascend to his throne. Jet crashes into highway. Just after 1:20 p.m. on August 22, 2015, a vintage Hawk Hunter jet began its display routine at Shoreham Air Show. Andy Hill, the 51-year-old pilot, was attempting something called a bent loop, a complex aerobatic maneuver that combines both pitching and rolling components. But what the crowd didn't know was that Hill had already made critical errors before the stunt even began. The aircraft entered the maneuver at 185 feet above ground level, flying at 310 knots, significantly below the required 500 feet minimum height and 40 knots slower than planned. Hill's own plan required a minimum apex height of 3,500 feet to execute the bent loop safely, but the Hunter achieved only between 2,700 and 2,950 feet. The engine wasn't operating at maximum thrust during the crucial climb phase, making it impossible to fully achieve the goal. Spectators soon began to sense something was wrong, but the jet just continued its descent toward the busy A27 highway. The Hunter slammed into the road at over 150 miles per hour, exploding into a massive fireball. The impact destroyed multiple vehicles, including cars carrying 2 young footballers who were traveling to a match. The explosion scattered wreckage across 400 yards of highway, ending the lives of 11 innocent people in a second. Hill survived with multiple injuries and was placed in a medically induced coma. During his 2019 trial, his defense argued he suffered cognitive impairment from G-forces, preventing him from executing an escape maneuver. The jury ultimately found him not guilty of all manslaughter charges. The sinking of SS Vestris. When Fred Hansen raised his camera to capture this image, he knew it might be the last photograph anyone would ever take of the SS Ventris. Around him, passengers scrambled desperately toward the portside lifeboats as the boat tilted further into the Atlantic. The photograph captures what investigators would later call a completely preventable disaster. Captain William Carey had delayed sending the SOS signal for nearly 20 hours after the ship first began taking on water. By November 12, 1928, it was too late to do anything. What makes this image particularly horrific is the way everything went wrong. Water had been pouring through an improperly sealed coal port since Sunday morning, but the captain refused to acknowledge it. The starboard boiler had already shut down by 4 a.m. Monday when that rising water made it inoperable, forcing crew members to organize a bucket brigade to bail water from flooded compartments. But when that proved useless, they abandoned the effort. The photograph shows passengers trying to maintain balance as the ship's deck disappeared beneath the waves. None of the 13 children aboard would survive, and only 8 of the 33 women would make it to rescue ships. Some crew members resorted to lowering boats for themselves, abandoning passengers on the tilting deck. At 2 p.m., the Vestris rolled completely over and sank. Hansen's photograph preserved the final moments when 111 people still had minutes left to live, and hopes quickly faded. Level 7. Family's one last photo on Malaysian flight. Dave Haley pressed his camera button one last time aboard Malaysia Airlines Flight 171. His wife Kim and 4-year-old daughter Megan smiled from their seats, unaware they had just posed for their final photograph. The family was heading to their dream vacation in Malaysia, a trip they had eagerly saved for. The Boeing 777 departed Amsterdam just hours earlier, carrying 298 passengers and crew members towards Kuala Lumpur. The aircraft cruised at 33,000 feet over eastern Ukraine, following an approved flight path that airlines had been using regularly. But suddenly, a Russian-made Buk surface-to-air missile system fired from rebel-controlled territory in eastern Ukraine. The warhead detonated outside and above the left side of the cockpit, sending over 800 high-energy fragments tearing through the aircraft. The cockpit crew died instantly as hundreds of pieces of shrapnel penetrated the forward section. The front portion of the plane broke away immediately, the rest of the aircraft remaining airborne for another 90 seconds before breaking apart completely. When it crash-landed, the wreckage was scattered across a 50-square-kilometer area in the Donetsk region. Investigation teams later determined the missile system originated from Russia's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade and had been transported into Ukraine specifically for this operation. All 298 people aboard died, including entire families who had been traveling together. Dave's photograph captured their last moment of normalcy before becoming victims of what international investigators called a deliberate and irreversible act of destruction. Snapshot of doom. This photograph captures Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie seated in their open-top car moments before the world changed. They're leaving Sarajevo City Hall on June 28, 1914, completely unaware that Gavrilo Princip is standing on a nearby street corner, ready to assassinate the Duke. Earlier that morning, a bomb had already bounced off their car, exploding under the vehicle behind them, wounding spectators and officials. Franz Ferdinand had angrily confronted local officials, saying, "So you welcome your guests with bombs?" But they continued, deciding to visit the injured at the hospital despite warnings it might be dangerous. When staff suggested Sophie stay behind for safety, she refused, saying, "As long as the Archduke shows himself in public today, I will not leave him." The driver took a wrong turn into Franz Josef Street. As the car stalled while reversing, Gavrilo Princip stepped forward from the sidewalk just 5 feet away. 2 shots rang out. The first bullet pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck. The second struck Sophie's abdomen. She asked her husband what had happened, then collapsed, bleeding. He pleaded desperately, urging her not to die, but both died within the hour. This single moment triggered a chain of events that led to World War I, ultimately claiming between 15 to 22 million lives. The total casualties included approximately 9 to 11 million military personnel and 6 to 13 million civilians. An entire generation was essentially wiped out across Europe, and it all started with those 2 fatal shots.